Welcome to this premiere episode of Let's Talk About God, where the focus is on just one thing, helping you know God better. I'm your host, Harris DeVories. Thank you for joining us. All of us are on a journey. That journey can seem very different because our life circumstances are so varied, but really it is a shared human experience. All of us are seeking to understand why we are here. God tells us in His Word that if you seek me, you will find me. This raises an important question. How do we go about seeking God? You can read the Bible to learn who God says that He is. You can pursue your relationship with Him in private time of prayer. But there is something you can't do by yourself, and that is to learn from the experiences that other people have with God. Each of us has a unique and subjective life experience, and God can show us eternal truths through the circumstances that we personally live through. I can learn things from you that I cannot get otherwise, and vice versa. That's the reason for this show. We're going to each week take a look at a different aspect of knowing God. Today's topic, who is God not? Now that may seem like a curious approach. Why would we want to start out by examining what is not true? When a subject is not well understood, it can be beneficial to determine what we can say is not true about it. Let me borrow an example from the field of science. A subject that is not well understood today is dark matter. There are many theories about dark matter, but what we know about it can largely be expressed in a negative sense. We could say that dark matter is invisible. That's why it's called dark matter. But what I'd like to do now is give you a biblical example of this principle. In a moment, I'm going to post a slide of Genesis chapter 22. But before I do, I'd like to share with you now the backstory of Abraham. Abraham is a man who was called by God and was given a promise. And that promise is that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. But Abraham had a problem. Year after year went by, and he did not have a child with his wife, Sarah. Well, after a series of misadventures, Abraham finally comes to the place where his wife miraculously conceives, and she gives birth to a son, Isaac. And all of Abraham's hopes for the future were pinned on this child of miraculous birth. One day, God comes to Abraham, and He tells him, Abraham, take your son, your only son whom you love, and offer him as a sacrifice to me on Mount Moriah. And we're not told the anguish that Abraham went through on that 3-day journey. We do know that when he got there, he was prepared to go through with it and to offer his only son as a sacrifice to the Lord. God does not let him do it. He tells him to stay his hand, do not hurt the boy. And we learn through this experience that God has provided a sacrifice instead, a ram caught by its horns in the thicket. Later on, God says that because you were willing to do this, Abraham, because you did not withhold your only son from me, when the time comes, impliedly, I will not withhold my only son from your descendants. Now, this is a watershed moment in humanity's relationship with God. But I want to look at one very narrow question, and that is, why did God set it up this way? From our modern perspective, this looks terrible. It's abhorrent. Child sacrifice. Why does God come off looking this way? Why didn't He present it differently? Well, to give you a meaningful answer to this question, I need to call your attention to the fact that we live in a postmodern society where child sacrifice is not part of our culture, thank goodness. But Abraham lived 4,000 years ago. Abraham lived in a culture that was polytheistic. The people around him worshipped many false gods, and they followed priests who demanded sacrifices. Sometimes the sacrifices required were their own children. Their society was completely foreign to ours today. Abraham lived in a world where this is what God's required. Through this passage, God communicates truth in a way that is very different than if he had made this statement similar to the way he does elsewhere. The books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy are full of long lists, and if you've read them, you've probably forgotten most of what they say. The point is this: no one who hears the story of Abraham and Isaac is going to forget it. Through this passage, God demonstrates that he is not like other gods. He will not make you sacrifice your children. He will be the one to make the sacrifice for them. What I'd like to do now is come forward about 4,000 years to our life experience. And I want to address today's question of who is God not from the perspective of what has been our life experience. And I'll start us off by sharing a story from my life, and then I very much want to hear from you as well. If you were to take a look at the story of my life and just randomly pick a moment from it, chances are pretty good you would select a moment where I did not believe in God. Because for much of my life, I was not a person who believed in God. And that would not be, of course, an accurate representation of who I am today. But I want to share with you very quickly the story of who I thought God was when I did not believe. You see, it's not a question of simply believing or not believing in God. The question really is, who do you first think God is when you have a mental construct of him? If your mental construct is flawed or distorted, as almost all of ours is as we go through life at one point or another, then in fact, the right response would be not to believe in God, as I did not for a long time. Now, let me share with you who I thought God was that I've learned he's not. First, I would have said God does not exist because I believed in the scientific explanation for things. But the God I did not believe in was a God who, perhaps a very long time ago, created things, and then he absented himself from that creation. In other words, he started things, but then he didn't take an interest in what it was that was going on in the world to create it. In a very real sense, it made no difference in my life whether I believed in God or not, because my concept of God was that he was not interested in me. So whether he didn't exist or he did exist, the final result really would be very little difference in my life because God didn't care about me. I was as insignificant to him as a speck on a seashore. Now, probably the most joyous discovery of my lifetime was coming to learn that that view of God was wrong. God is not an impersonal God who does not take an interest in us. God cares very deeply for each of us. And when my mental concept of who God was changed, that provoked within me a different response. And that response was one of believing in that God who was interested in me. Now, if you had asked me before this time, Harris, are you ever going to believe in God? My answer would be no, because I know my character, I know who I am, and I'm not a person who's going to believe in something for the sake of believing. And as long as my mental concept of God was flawed and distorted, the correct response based on who I am would be not to believe. What changed was not merely the matter of my belief. What changed was my concept of who God is, and then the response of belief came naturally to me. And for the past 35 years, it has defined my life. So for me, that is who God is not. He is not a God who is disinterested in my life. He very much cares about me and about you. So what I'd like to do now is open things up to a discussion and invite you to share something that you used to think about God, but learned over time that concept was incorrect. Now, there are several rules to our site. Please be courteous, respectful, wait until no one else is speaking, unmute your device so that we can hear you, and then mute when you finish. I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Who'd like to share their story of what they used to believe about God that they've learned is not true?
Hi, I'm Mary. I don't know all of you, but I know Harris from Upsale Presbyterian, but I'm going to stay on topic here. When I was growing up, I grew up in a household that said, if you do this, God's going to get you. You know, so I grew up in a household where God was fear. And everything you did, you were accountable, and it was fearful. And so, you know, you go through life and things don't always go your way. And you only went to God, you know, when you desperately needed someone and had no one else. Well, throughout the years, and especially, I'd say the last 10 years or so, I know that God is love and that he loves me. And I don't have to fear him. I respect him. So there's a difference there. It's not that fear he's going to get me, but a fear that he is my father and he takes care of me and that he loves me. And that's what I know about God. Yeah.
And that's a wonderful lesson to have learned, that God may be presented to us one way when we're children, but as we grow in maturity, we are going to change our mental construct of who God is. And don't put yourself in a box and say, well, I am a certain way. I'm not going to change beyond that. Your character may not change, but your understanding of God should. And let me say just a moment about that. My understanding of who God is has not essentially changed in the 35 years I've walked with him. What has changed, in some cases significantly, is I have, through study, focused in on different aspects, and I have gained a deeper understanding in places than I had when I got started. So I don't want you to think that my understanding of God has not changed in any way. What hasn't changed is the essential concept of who God is. It is like that concept was out of focus for most of my life, and while it was out of focus, I did not believe. But then there came a point in my life where the concept of God came sharply into focus, and it's remained there for these last decades. Who else wants to share their story?
It's Moika. So I came from a Catholic background in Europe, and everything was stereotyped, including God and the church and how we grew up and what we're supposed to believe and what we think of God. So it was a total change for me coming to this country and all of a sudden seeing there's no particular religions that you belong to. Only one religion was always right, and that was the Catholic religion. So it took me many years to realize, wait a minute, we were raised in this stereotype of religion that's not there at all. And I started realizing at that point, what was God not? And all the things I learned, he was not. So I had to rethink my relationship with God. There was a relationship I didn't really have before. It was just tradition, basically. You go to church every Sunday, you go to church to holidays. So, just because I missed a Sunday now doesn't mean I'm going to have to go to confession because I missed a Sunday. So it was a new experience for me and still is. I'm still learning, and I never learned to read the Bible. Now I read the Bible, try to understand what it says. I don't understand it all yet, but I do it. So that was the beginning for me, and it didn't happen until I was in my 30s, really.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I think that each of us can relate to the idea that we once thought things about God that weren't, as it turns out, true. And when we were able to distill and to clarify what it is that is true about God, that it drew us closer to him. To me, that's the essence of a pursuit of a relationship with God, is the more I have understood him, the closer I have felt to him, and the more I have wanted to serve him. Who else wants to share a story?
Oh, hi. Hi, this is Juan Rubio from Winter Park, Florida. Hi, everyone. My story is about, I also grew up in a religious household, and it was instilled on us that if you don't behave, you will go to hell. It was just one of those things that you got to do to stay on track, to keep you, instead of discipline you, they used to put those ideas in your head. You start not loving God, you're just hating God because of that reason. Later on, I learned in life that God wasn't that. What I was hearing all this time, using religion to instill fear and on us. And in some parts of some countries, they still use the fear of God to instill fear on their people. The governments use that as a tool, and that's not God. For me, God is love. For me, God is patience. For me, God is forgiveness. For me, God is which is one source. And I know that everybody has different religions, but I believe deep down inside, all religions are just one God, one source. And I believe in God's love. God has given me everything that I have at this moment, and I'm grateful every day for what he has provided to me. But I believe God is none of that. God is not politics. God doesn't have a favorite soccer team. God doesn't have any favorite color. God loves everything and everyone. Thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I think that all of us can relate to the experience of rejecting something about what we have heard along the way. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to toss out the baby with the bathwater. You may have been raised with a sincere faith, and over time, you have come to refine that faith for you as you have drawn closer to God yourself. But some of us will have experiences of being far from God. And those of us who didn't grow up that way can learn from those who did what that was like and what that taught you about God as you were growing closer to him. Well, I think we have time for one or two more stories. Who would like to share your personal story of what you have learned was not true about God?
Hey, Harris, this is Myrna. Hi, everybody. This isn't necessarily my personal story, but I see this happening more and more just working in ministry and stuff with all these things that are happening with, the shootings of the children and stuff. I'm hearing a lot of people say that God is not love. How can he allow this to happen? And I think that brings up a good point, because we have people grow up with a misconception of what God is by all these personal stories that we're hearing. And then when something tragic like this happens, people see God as he's not that God of love. How can he allow all these kids to die so tragically and so forth? So I wanted to bring that up on the other aspect that that people have, they justify these things that are obviously God allows them, but they come from the pit of hell. But my point is they justify these things for them not to want to serve a God that they think is not of love. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
I know exactly what you mean. Let me give you an illustration of a conversation I had just a couple of weeks ago on this exact issue. A woman texted me and said that she was very angry. Something was going on, and she was very upset with her husband. And she said, "How can I believe in a loving God?" And so I asked her if she was upset with me. And she said, "Well, why would I be upset with you? You didn't do anything wrong." And so my response was, "Well, then why are you upset with God? He isn't the one who did these things. He's not the one who chose these things. The choice he made was to allow you and me and everyone else to have free will. And once he did that, he was choosing to give us control of this world and to allow us to make good and bad choices, to love and to make unloving choices. But it's wrong for people to be upset with God and to blame God for choices that he didn't make any more than you or I made them." So thank you for bringing that up. That's a really good observation. We've got time for another story. Who wants to share something that you have either heard someone else say that's not true, or something you personally thought was true and then you learned that isn't true about God?
Harris?
Yes, go ahead.
This is Dave Foster. I'm on in Richland, Washington State. Longtime friend of Harris's. One of the big things that I had to overcome is the thought that God could not possibly use me. And it's that simple.
And how did you learn the truth?
So I was in Cambodia and delivering a simple gospel message, if you will, the road to salvation, sharing it with people who may never hear the story again. And I've shared that story before, but this was the first time to do it in a different culture and going through a translator. And I got finished with my message, and the translator, who was a pastor, local pastor there in Cambodia, he started in on his prayer, and it was right then that my heart sunk and I realized I forgot about a fourth of my message. And in the middle of this pastor's prayer, I'm crying out to God, "I am so sorry, Lord. I have failed you. One chance that these people have to hear the message, and I failed you." And it was right then at a very low point for me during this pastor's prayer that he then asked for a raise of hands for salvation. And 3 people raised their hands. And it was immediately that I realized what God was telling me in that moment. He was saying, "See, David, it's not about you. If you do what I'm asking you to do, I will succeed. God will succeed."
So in other words, we don't have to be perfect for him to use us.
Exactly.
Well, let's take a moment and just give thanks for the opportunity to be able to freely talk about what it is that we've learned about God. I think that is a privilege that people are recognizing more and more is not to be taken for granted. And I appreciate you being here today, being part of this premiere, this launch of Let's Talk About God, and I look forward to our next meeting together. Thank you, and God bless.